Welcome back to Beyond the Wrench. I am your host, Jay Goninen. Today I have with me Jon Olstad, who is the technician team lead at Walser Polar Chevrolet. Jon has worked in the industry for 23 years at the same store. He holds several certifications and specializes in advanced diagnostics. In Jon's new role as shop lead, his focus has changed from producing for himself to helping the shop maintain and grow production. Through the process of training both new and old techs on how to diagnose vehicles, Jon has increased the volume at their location significantly. Overall, this role has been a big growing process for Jon, and through it, he has learned a lot about how to educate others and has developed into a better mentor. Currently, Jon is striving to create a more cohesive team between service parts and service advisors at his shop. Jon, happy to have you today. Being able to create a more cohesive team between service parts and service advisors seems like a really, really big task. How's that going?
It's kind of a new one, but yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here. It's a challenge. It's for a long time in the industry. It's always kind of been you get the guys in the service department that they take the jabs at service advisors and at parts guys that don't seem to want to help them the way they want to be helped. And through just kind of my journey of trying to do this the last couple months, and a lot of it just comes down to ultimately just a miscommunication, and a misunderstanding. It's one of them things where it's trying the shoe on the other, the other foot, so to speak, seeing what
Yeah.
it's like from the other perspective, and a lot of people have a hard time doing that. So if you sat in a service advisor's chair, what do they deal with when they're talking to a customer? Because one of the complaints we always have as technicians is you didn't get enough information. How can I fix it with it's broken? Well, there's sometimes language barriers. Sometimes the customers just don't know how to describe it.
Yeah.
They think it's a whistle or a squeak and it's really a rattle. So
It's
it's a challenge.
it's such an interesting thing in our industry because I don't think this is exclusive to one dealership or one shop. It's hard. Communication is hard. I think it's really easy to talk about in being a good communicator, but the challenges that exist between the different silos, and I know we all try to tear down the silos. We want people actively having a good relationship and talking, but a lot of times you'll still go to lunchroom and the parts people are still eating with the parts people, the advisors are eating with the advisors, the techs are eating with the techs, and it's almost kind of like that middle school dance a little bit, right, where everybody's kind of in their
Absolutely.
own group. And I think being able to tear down those silos is really important.
Yeah, and some of it comes to do with trust. They don't trust them to do it the right way or to ask the right questions or to look up the right parts or whatever. Maybe a parts guy's looked up a couple parts that are wrong and they just think that that's going to happen all the time. But they don't know what it's like from their perspective. And I was fortunate enough to be part of a leadership seminar kind of thing about a year ago. And the speaker, one of the things that really resonated with me is he said, trust is the world's greatest currency, and trust is built through communication. And he built a way, and through that, he built a kind of a mental picture of what communication looks like. And ultimately, it's like, you can kind of see the picture behind me. Like if we were having a conversation and I was trying to describe that picture, but you didn't see the bear, you know, that that's a miscommunication because you're not seeing the same picture in your mind as I am. So
It's hard. And I think I have so much respect for you for understanding that and wanting to get better at it, enhance, your communication skills and really being able to understand the other side. Because I think, in my opinion, that's maybe where technicians go wrong, and we'll talk a lot about that throughout the course of this podcast. And I love this subject, but before we dive too deep into that, I do want to talk about you a little bit. 23 years at the same store. I don't feel like you see that as much now as you used to, and I want to kind of get your thinking behind that. Right, I think it's such a credit to you for that loyalty, for that familiarity with that dealership, to stick around forever. Is that something that you strived for when you came in? Is that something that you looked at, or was it just, hey, they treat me really good, I'm happy, I'm good?
Well, it definitely had its bumpy road along the way, and there were times where it just didn't seem like it was a good fit. You get different managers, you get different heads in there, and the biggest difference I can say now would be is you got a lot of talk before, and now there's a lot of action.
Mm,
There's a quote that I kind of remind myself about a lot, that your words are empty containers that you fill with your actions. And it just seemed like there was a lot
that's
of
good.
empty containers floating around, and just no action. Another way to say it is they're just sweeping stuff under the rug. And there were definitely times I wanted to move on, but my criteria was kind of selfish, I guess. I was still able to make a good living, and as long as that was able to happen, I got a pretty thick skin. So it was kind of water off a duck's back kind of thing for me. So I just hung on to it, because throughout the years, every couple of years, we would get a change, whether it be in management, and then in 2017 ownership. And it always gave you this like glimmer of hope, right? And you kind of hold on to that. And it's like, okay, something's going to happen this time. There's gotta be somebody else out there that doesn't want it to run this way. And after the Walser Corporation took over, it took some time, because you got to build that trust up with the leadership of the Walser Corporation, that they were filling their containers with action, and I latched onto that, and that's kind of where it led me to today.
I don't think there's a better compliment for a shop than that, right? And I love that analogy. I love the way that the visual that paints with the container and filling it up with actions. And it's so cool to see that, right? Like, I think so many people get scared when something like that happens, and it's part of life, right? Like, I feel like that drives anxiety, but the fact that they came in and calmed that anxiety with some of their actions, I think speaks volumes about them. And to hear you talk in that capacity about them, I think really is an honest look, but also like a really, really positive look on them. So I think that's really cool. And I do think, as we're talking about that, that's one of the major frustrations we hear from technicians a lot, right? Is, hey, I went to go work for this place and they said they were going to do this and they never did any of it. And I think it's not just technicians. I think that's anybody. I think I've been in that situation before, where I went to go work somewhere and it wasn't quite the picture that they had painted once I got there, right? And I think just
Absolutely.
that's where you grow trust. Like, if you are lying to them right off the bat, as an employer, the trust isn't going to be there, right? Like, if you're
Right.
embellishing on how good you are, just to get them in the door, they're going to learn firsthand, if you're not living up to expectations.
And I think that even starts with the interview process at the beginning. When you go to an interview, what do you typically do as a technician coming into a shop? You're going to put your best foot forward. And so much of the time, that interview process is one-sided, when it should be a two-way street. Me sitting there interviewing for a technician position, well, I should have questions for them, because
Yes.
it's not only I'm trying to sell myself, to see if I'm a good fit there. Stop selling yourself. Just be you. Be who you are, and that way when you start, and then a month later and 2 months later, it's the same you. It's not somebody different. If you struggle with electronics, tell them.
Yeah.
Don't try and hide it. Don't try and say, oh yeah, I'm really good at it. But on the flip side, ask the employee, like, I'm part of most of the interview processes for anything with the shop. So anything, we haven't had any recent technician ones, but quick lube runners, admins, that kind of stuff. I'm part of that now. And one of the questions I ask is, do you have any questions for us? Because this is a two-sided interview. I mean, we need to make sure you're a good fit for us, but you also need to make sure that we're a good fit for you.
Yes. I think that is so important. That, not to bring WrenchWay into the discussion. I rarely talk about WrenchWay on the podcast, but that's one of the big reasons for the page, is that we want a technician to be able to do their due diligence on a shop and be able to ask questions and come to that interview with good questions in hand, or at least having thought through, like, okay, this is interesting. I don't quite understand what they're saying here. Maybe can you dive into a little bit more detail? And for those technicians that are out there listening right now, John's advice is so important. When you're going into that interview, you need to have some questions for that shop, right? You need to be able to ask them smart questions so that going into it. And I always point to one of the questions we have on the Top Shops pages, which is, what is your policy on side work? If it's strictly prohibited and you've got a very lucrative side business, you need to come to terms with that. Either that's not going to be a fit or something's out of whack. But I use that example a lot because it is one of those things where I think there's a lot of miscommunication about up front, and then that can turn into a weird situation down the road. But that's just one example of different opportunities to ask questions and be honest, be upfront with it. Because if it is going to be a conflict of interest, or maybe that's not in your best interest, make sure you ask about it. Because if the more clarity you have on that, the better off and the more happy you're going to be once you go into that shop.
I completely agree.
Exciting news! You now have more time to earn free t-shirts by referring your industry friends to WrenchWay. Here's how it works. Retrieve your referral code or link by logging into your WrenchWay account and going to your profile. Don't worry if you don't already have a WrenchWay account, you can create one for free. Then, share your code with your friends. Make sure those you refer enter in your referral code when they create their WrenchWay account so you get the credit. WrenchWay has 3 t-shirt designs up for grabs that include popular industry sayings like, "Waiter's gonna wait," "Make mechanics cool again," and "Fix what others can't." The more people you refer, the more t-shirts you can get. Offer ends June 30th, 2023. Click the link in the show notes to get started.
So let's talk about the progression of your career, right? You've recently moved into a team lead type of role, but started your career as a technician, right?
Yep.
What got you into it to start with? Like, what was it that it was like the trigger, like, hey, this be pretty cool to do?
To be an automotive technician?
Yeah.
Actually, from the age that I can remember, I've always taken stuff apart, from my mom's Casio electronic calculator to the Ferrari RC car that I got when I was probably 8, wanting to know how things work. And, my dad was a mechanical engineer, and kind of growing up, he just kind of, my brother went into mechanical engineering. So I thought, that might be my path. So I actually did 2 years in mechanical engineering and just decided that it wasn't something I wanted to do. And ended up going to work at a shop. Before that, I guess back up a little bit. In high school, I was an assistant manager for Valvoline Rapid Oil Change as a junior in high school. So I experienced my first hiring and firings of people at that age. And then kind of transitioned into college, tried the mechanical engineering route. Just didn't see it for me. Not internship, but shadowed a couple different companies, and I just didn't think this was my fit. Ended up going to work for a Kennedy transmission shop and just R&R and transmissions. I kind of liked it. And the guy actually happened to mention the General Motors ASAP program. So it's the General Motors sponsored program through one of the community colleges in my town, or near my town. And I'm like, I'm looking into that. And that was really the start of it, into the automotive industry. I've always kind of had an interest in them. I've always liked working on them. I've always done the little stuff that, everybody does, brakes, struts, shocks, that kind of stuff, right? My first car was a 1971 Chevrolet Cheyenne, 4-wheel drive K truck. Yep. So
the value in those skyrocketed in the last 10 years or 5 years.
Yeah. And I sold it about 10 years ago. So it was before that. But I had it since when did I buy that? 98, 97, something like that. So, but yeah, I learned so much on that just by playing with it. I taught myself carburetors. I taught myself, the very little electrical that it did have. But yeah, that was kind of my first experience of just digging into stuff. Like, I wasn't going to pay anybody to do it. I was going to figure it out on my own. So
I say this a lot, but in my experience, the best technicians are the ones that have that analytical thought process like you do, right? Where they want to know how things work, how they function, and want to have a true understanding of it. Whereas a technician like me growing up, who was not a good technician, wanted to just fix it as fast as possible, throw everything together. And I think in some ways, those even today might be more of those part swappers that just want to, throw a part on it and get it out as fast as possible. But in my experience and the many great technicians I've known over the years, having that understanding of how things work is so important. And if I could go back and tell my young self something, that would be one of those things. Figure out how to be a problem solver, figure out how things work and function correctly, because that's what is going to make you a good technician. Does that make sense? Am I kind of
Oh
on
no,
point there?
no, 100%. And I mean, I kind of went into the other ditch on that. I'd get I'd end up replacing a fuse block. Well, I wasn't content with just replacing the fuse block. I took it apart and found the trace on the circuit board that was burnt, or, an HMI module that was, drawing power and finding the blown MOSFET, the power MOSFET inside on the board that was pulling the power, So I kind of got into the weeds on it a lot, but I've also fixed a lot of cars like that by doing that when parts aren't available. So, there's,
That's big right now. We did a podcast a few months ago where we had a gentleman come on and talk about how is Pedro de la Toro, and when he was talking about it, they were having trouble finding ECUs for like Subarus or something like that, and they couldn't find them. So he started taking them apart and finding what was wrong in the circuit boards and being able to, kind of solder a new connection, get them up and running. And going through that podcast, I'm like, my goodness, that's a different level of understanding. And it sounds like you're kind of in that same boat.
Yeah, I mean, the most notable one I did was, it was probably about 10 years ago, and it was on like an '06 Duramax, and the Duramaxes use a different fuse block than the gas engines did, and they weren't available anymore, and it had corrosion in it. So I took it apart, and I used some rubbing alcohol, cleaned it all up, and fixed the traces that were in there, and then put it back together and sent him on his way. But it basically, I'm trying to remember if I think he might have just not had the cover on all the way, or maybe had modified it, which was allowing water to get in it. And like, well, we can either try and find a used one, or I can try and fix it. What do you want to do? And I said, well, if you think you can fix it, go ahead. Well, that's a challenge to me. So I'm like, well, I know I can fix it, So I dug into it. That was kind of right in the beginning stage of when I really got into electronics. It's kind of a hobby of mine too. So I do a lot of that stuff at home, but
I'm super jealous of people with that ability, because it is so cool to dig inside the mind of somebody that thinks the way that you do. And, as I look at it, I can't help but think this is the reason why we need to have more patience with our young technicians as well, right? Because we need to have the ability to give them time to explore a little bit and learn, rather than put a ton of pressure immediately on the billable hours, right? Because I think the more you can kind of have a little bit of a looser rein on a younger tech for them to discover on their own. And I think, again, going back to what the best technicians I see do, maybe they're taking that junk controller home with them and tearing it apart and being able to find the fault, or doing something over and above. But it might take them a little bit longer at first, just because they are exploring and they are trying to understand a system and how something works. Did you see that in your growth as a technician, that maybe you sacrificed some early days productivity to be able to truly just understand a system?
I didn't really see much in sacrifice, but that was definitely me. I mean, so I started in 2000, and in 2000 and late 2003, 2004, they came up to me, and the dispatcher said, "Hey, we need you, somebody else to start learning diesels," and handed me a Kodiak C4500. I'm like, okay.
All right.
So that was my introduction to diesels, and then took all the diesel training from that. And then in 2000, it's probably later that year, it's like, well, we need somebody to do EVs. You're going to Chicago in 2 weeks. I'm like, okay, I guess I'll be that guy too. So it was, and we didn't, that, especially on the EV side of things, that was the first time outside of the good old EV1 in the 90s. That was the first time General Motors had anything mass produced, which was the Malibu hybrid and the parallel hybrid truck. in their mid 2000s. So you didn't really have much help, even technical assistance when those things came out, even when the bolts came out in recent years. The first year they come out, they're not much help, so you're kind of on your own. So it's definitely what I was used to, but I also kind of, and I welcomed the challenge, I guess. I liked the challenge. A lot of people, you ask the guys in my shop if I like doing maintenance work, and the answer is no. I actually hate getting oily, but I like the challenging stuff. The hard part was, when you're constantly inundated with the challenging stuff, it's harder to make money.
What do you see it from a technician's shoes? The EV side, I'm always curious to kind of learn. I think it's the technology is fascinating, but I want to kind of get your sense as to how much of a challenge it is, how much of a shift in the way you work is it. Give me an idea what EV looks like from the shoes of a technician.
If I understand your question correctly, it's the safety's obviously there. You got to have your PPE, your gloves, your boots. Take all your metal stuff off, all that kind of stuff. You have your dead alive or alive dead alive checks that you need to do on different connections depending on what you're working in. You got to know it's hot all the time. So there's definitely your awareness has to be way up, and you got to get people to stay away from you, especially if you're not super comfortable with it right away. So there is that, and it is dangerous, more dangerous than anything else we work on, because it's, on our EVs, even our extended range electric vehicle, the Volt, that one is running, nominal voltage is 390 volts. So it doesn't take much to jump to you and jump through your body. So you got to make sure you're not working on water, you're not doing something stupid. So yeah, it's definitely a different approach. But as long as you're aware of that and as you take those precautions, I don't personally see it as that big a deal. A lot of people are also afraid of diesel,
Right.
And it's like, it still uses compression and it spits fuel into it and it burns it. It just doesn't have spark plugs. What makes diesel so difficult nowadays, since probably 2011, when they really started adding DEF, is the emission stuff. I mean, almost all the problems we deal with on diesels is just emissions, and it's learning how all those systems interact with each other and what they can cause for faults. Because a stupid DEF injector can cause your truck to only go 25 miles an hour if you ignore it. It's like, really.
It's a lot to learn. I have never thought of this before, but as it relates to EVs, you're located in Minnesota. In the winter, cars get snow on them. Yep. And it's got to be hard to do a quick repair on an EV, doesn't it? Because if you've got to pull it in, wait for it to melt off, or maybe plan just a little bit better to get it in there and get it dried off in general. I hadn't really thought of that before, but that seems like an additional challenge.
Yeah, I mean, if you're pulling a battery, like, obviously right now we're probably in the middle of the recall. We haven't seen any couple of months here yet, but the Bolt had the battery recall. So the recall is we're swapping out the entire battery assembly. And something like that comes in, we know, hey, if it's not getting worked on that day, let's get it inside, keep it dry, keep it warm, because stuff doesn't like to come apart, when you just start ripping and tearing when it's 4 degrees. So
it's an interesting, like you said, I think you had a great analogy and a great comparison in that there's similar reservations to working on a diesel, and it's just more embracing the change and being able to educate yourself enough to be able to know what to do. And I think that segues really nicely into some of the recent changes you've had yourself in the shop, right? And going from more of that line technician to a technician team lead, taking more of a leadership role as a whole. Talk to me about how it's gone so far. Has it been a big transition for you, or just maybe kind of a seeing things through a different light, or not that much of a change at all?
It's probably about in the middle, I would say. I mean, before the change, I was definitely one of the guys that people would go to when they got stuck. Electrical issues, anything advanced diagnostic, even mechanical issues. Early on, I got a lot of like squeaks, rattles, wind noises, water leaks. So learned how to get good at those different tricks and different tricks and stuff that I had figured out on myself on my own. So along the way, I've always kind of had a little bit of a mentoring role or the old guy in the shop kind of role that people would go to, even though I wasn't that old yet. But yeah, I mean, the transition was fairly simple from there, and I don't know, I guess I'm trying to think before the role I had up to I think 4. I was on my 5th apprentice already. So we've sponsored now 6. In my career, we've sponsored 6 ASEP students in the industry, and I had all of them. So
Wow. How did you look at that responsibility? Because I know that's not for every experienced tech, or, when you look at the best of the best, I think there's a lot of divided technicians on what they feel like their role is with an apprentice or bringing somebody on to
yeah.
really mentor. What was it like for you? I mean, bringing these young people on and really being their mentor. I think it's easy to, again, like we talked about with communication, it's easy to say that you're a leader, but when you look at it from a mentorship point of view, it can be a challenge. So walk me through that side. How did you like that side? You must have liked it a little bit to keep doing it, but was it something that you embraced, or was it something that was like kind of oh man, that's another thing for me to do?
Well, first I was voluntold. So I was voluntarily told that I was going to have the first one. I'm like, okay, just, I knew what it was like because I did it. And I took it upon myself to kind of try and break some of the stereotypes that kind of go along with, the mechanic world. When you have an apprentice or somebody new in the shop, they kind of fall into maybe 1 to 3 buckets. The first one being you just leave them alone and they figure it out all on their own. That's not good. And the other one being, well, you're going to be my gopher boy. You're going to help me make more money. Well, that's not good either, because all it does is make you look really selfish.
Right.
And then the third one is, well, can I help develop this person into the technician that could work alongside me? That could be another individual that could be the future person that is relied upon for help or the knowledge that they have. And I chose the third bucket, obviously.
Good for you.
And tried to take people along that journey. And a lot of the times it came down to essentially unteaching what was taught at school, because the manufacturers have their way of teaching diagnostic. And that was obviously the main focus. Mechanical stuff, taking an engine apart, you just got to do that a couple times. You got to watch them do it, make sure they kind of know how to run fasteners in and all that kind of stuff. Make sure they're not breaking stuff that's going to add 3 hours to the job kind of thing. But for the most part, it was always focused around the diagnostic and the electrical side of things. A lot of people struggle with that. A lot of seasoned technicians struggle with that even. And in my view and in my opinion, it has more to do with the approach that was taken in the way they were taught, and then also in the way they continue to proceed. And it's just mindset. How are you approaching that problem? Are you immediately going to the flow charts? Because the flow charts aren't going to lead you there. Because my fellow technicians out there know that we're probably in the realm of 70 to 80% of the stuff we touch when it's electronics is intermittent. It's not a hard fail. So therefore it's a process of, educated elimination, essentially, finding out, okay, well, getting enough symptom information from the customer and leading them down that path of like, okay, well, they have so many codes for everything now. It's like, okay, you get a certain code for a circuit code, a circuit performance code. Well, can you make it set other codes? If you short it out, will the ECM set a short to voltage? Will it set a short to ground? And if it can do that, doesn't that tell you that your circuits are good? And therefore you have a bad sensor solenoid, whatever it is. So it had more to do with thought process than actual knowledge. And we talked about this when we talked last week. One of my texts from UTI, so yeah, I've never heard that from my teachers. And it's just a different way of thinking, you know. They're told or essentially teaching you the way the manufacturers want it done, and that's going to be to do it the cheapest, most efficient way from their eyes when it's failed. Well, what do you do when it's not failed? Because when it's not failed, are you standing there like a deer in the headlights, not knowing what to do? Because you don't understand the system. You don't understand how to read a schematic. You don't understand what's happening with the vehicle based on what the customer's saying, you know, that kind of thing. So that was probably the biggest struggle in the beginning with the apprentices. But
yeah, I one thing to note there that I think is really interesting, in the longer I've been around the industry, the more I think I understand this. The ability for a technician who is a mentor to be able to set their culture within the shop, it's so much more impactful when you've got one of your leaders inside the shop that is training. And when they have the mindset that you do, which is, I want to know who I'm going to be working next to. And I think even from like a personality standpoint and an attitude standpoint, if that mentor is negative or are, begrudgingly doing it, I don't think you get the impact. But when somebody takes the approach that you did, you're bringing somebody up, and I think that adds to your culture so much, because then it's not the young guys versus the older generation that, you get a lot of that infighting. But I think it helps build relationships within the shop. I think it allows you to set an expectation of what your standard is up front.
mm-hmm.
And I think that leading from within is so powerful in a shop. And I've said this over and over again, even when I was managing on the industry side, I had a leadership role, but I don't know that I ever wanted them to respect me more than they did the lead in the shop. Right. I always wanted that leader in the shop to be the one that was, looked upon as the ultimate expert, the ultimate, just the ultimate leader. And whether those kind of team leads in a shop know it or not, they kind of set the standard for all of that. And being able to really drive the culture from within, I think, is the most powerful way of doing that. I'm curious if you'd agree with that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it comes down to, I personally don't like the term foreman, team lead, whatever you want to call it. I personally like more the analogy of we are all on the same team. I'm still a technician. I still fix cars. I still diagnose. I just do it in a different way. And so I'm a peer with everybody else in the shop, but I'm maybe more looked at as like your team captain, like in football or baseball or whatever. So that's the way I like to view it, because it keeps me, I hope, in from my perspective, that it keeps me on this, and I should say maybe in the other technicians' perspectives, that it keeps me on the same page as them. I'm not above them. I'm not their leader. I'm not their boss. I'm here to help you. And then ultimately, kind of come back to your comment to your culture is, one of the things that the leadership in the organization is really keyed in on this last year is what you tolerate will become your culture. So if you tolerate people with crappy attitudes, it's going to become your culture. You get the whole, you won't hear it as much in my shop anymore, but when I started, it's like, oh, you're an idiot for doing this industry. What? You're stupid. What's wrong with your brain? That you got into this industry. And it's like, well, I like it. I like working on cars. I like the challenge, and I got good at it. Is everybody going to be good at it right away? No. And shame on education institutions that teach these future mechanics that, oh yeah, you're going to come out of it making 80 grand a year. No, don't get some reality into you. Find out what, the minimum rate is. You got to understand that you might start there. You might not. But, kind of getting off in the weeds a little bit.
No, you're good.
So yeah.
I think that I think you're spot on there, by the way, where, being able to really paint an accurate picture of what the career path for a young technician is going to look like, and not setting an unreasonable expectation is huge. uh, I've talked about this a lot, right? Where when you state that, and maybe the expectation is that I'm going to be coming out and I'm not that far from six figures right away, just isn't realistic. And nor does if a young person were to look at this, and I was able to look back at myself as a younger person in jumping at money, I feel like there's so much value in, if you can sit back, not expect the world in terms of pay, but find the right spot that's going to mentor you and treat you right and get you to the training you need, get you the experience that you need. Uh, that's going to have a far greater impact on your career than if you just get paid a bunch right away and there's a lot of pressure on you to produce right away because you're getting paid a lot right away. And then you get chewed up and spit out by our industry. If you can take the long-term view and really figure out the spot that is going to treat you right, and in a place that you get along with the folks that are in the building, and just you feel comfortable with, I think there's so much value in that for a young technician to get in a spot that they're comfortable with as a whole.
Yeah, and here we try and strive. You're not an island onto your own. You're not all by yourself. You're not just going to be thrown in an RO that it's got a paragraph long complaint and hey, here, good luck. It's where there is a time and a place for that. That is still an old school way of thinking, is just figure it out on your own. I had to. Well, and you leave somebody to that, they get into, I guess how I've been referring to it lately is they end up like Alice in Wonderland, and you don't know what hole they went down, and sometimes they don't even know what hole they're in, and so for me, in the way that I've structured our shop, with the new people and learning and that kind of stuff, our standard in the industry was basically 3/10 for diagnosis under a warranty repair. It's 18 minutes. So if they don't have an answer or a direction of what they want to do in 18 minutes, they need to come find me. And then we need to know, we need to figure out where to go from there. And that keeps them out of the rabbit hole. There are definitely going to be some times where you need to go in the rabbit hole. But you can go too far. And that's what we want to try and avoid. Because when you go too far, then all you remember from the experience is how much it sucked.
Yeah.
Whereas if we can keep you, right in there, right in the reality part of things and not in the rabbit hole, it helps you also learn, but it also helps you understand that there's a different way than what maybe you were thinking of doing. So,
Well, I think from a mentorship standpoint, it helps you get to reinforce the basics, right? I think a mistake that so many young techs make is that they try to, skip over steps, get to they see maybe the tech down the a couple bays down that's using a scope, and they're doing a lot of advanced diagnostics, whereas a lot of times it's just that basic stuff. And if you're not checking the basics first, oftentimes you're just going to misdiagnose stuff, or you're not going to get to a conclusion of what is actually wrong with the vehicle. Uh, it's got to help after that 18 minutes to just kind of touch base and say, okay, have you checked this? Have you checked the codes? Have you checked the schematic? Like just being able to kind of walk through a diagnostic process so you can reinforce that with them.
Yeah, and for the most part, I have my S word. My S word is schematic. So when somebody's stuck, I mean, the first thing they hear come out of my mouth is, "Where's your schematic?" And I don't. For me personally, it needs to be printed. I don't want to see it on a screen because I'm going to make notes on it. I'm going to write on it. And the beauty of the technology that we have now in vehicles is we have an onboard we have an onboard scope essentially, and DVOM in the cars. My example earlier when I said performance code. You're trying to figure it out, and the schematic wants you to go unplug X whatever and pin this one, and go to ECM X2 and pin that one, and they want. Well, why don't you just make the ECM tell you what's wrong with it? Short down the signal wire. Does it set a short to ground code? Well, if it does that tell you the wire's good? Well, yeah. Okay. So then what does it do if you put it to a short voltage? Does the ECM detect that it's shorted voltage? Yeah. Okay. So then what do you need? You need the sensor or the part
Right.
that it's flagging for. There's so many ways now that you can use the vehicle to actually tell you what's wrong with it. There's very rarely now that I need to bring out my DVOM or even my test light for that. So
That's interesting.
They've made it, whether they did it on purpose or not, or I'm essentially manipulating the system. It works, and I've been doing that way for more than a decade. So it's it's kind of eye opening and like light bulb-ish when you show that to a young technician or a new technician, and it's like, well, I didn't think you could do that. Well, why not?
Right.
They got to build safeties in there. Okay, so a mouse chews through a wiring harness and shorts out the signal circuit to battery voltage, and as it chewed on it, it tied them together. Well, you can't expect that a manufacturer's, or a rock hits a harness. You can't expect a manufacturer to not protect their computer. They're just not going to do that, especially when it's on their dime sometimes. So they're going to build in their safeties, and it's going to cut off the transistors inside the computer. That's going to cut power to that circuit. So there's so many different ways you can use the computers on the cars to fix their own faults.
As a young technician, that was the number one thing I was most terrified of, was because whether through tech school or through bosses of frying a computer, right? Because I'd heard it so often that, like, hey, if you screw this up, that's $1,000 on you, or whatever the price was. Yep. And you're like, oh man, I'm terrified to even get close to touching this thing because I don't want to pay $1,000 for something.
Right.
Technicians, have you checked out WrenchWay yet? WrenchWay is a free online community for automotive and diesel professionals. Whether you're looking for a job or not, WrenchWay makes it easy to explore new opportunities, stay up to date on what's going on with the auto diesel community in your area, and help improve and promote the technician profession. Check out all the job details you care about before you apply or interview with WrenchWay Top Shops. Open to new job opportunities but don't want to apply yet? Create an anonymous reverse job post and let shops reach out to you. See what's going on in the industry and in your area through WrenchWay Shop Talk. Join the WrenchWay online community for free by visiting WrenchWay.com or by downloading the WrenchWay mobile app. Links are in the show notes.
Yeah. So as you've shifted and gone to the other side of the equation a little bit, right? You're really you've taken that leadership growth journey to being on maybe that leadership side. And I'm curious what you've learned in going and looking at it through a different lens. Has it been, does it change your view on anything as you've kind of moved to the other side? Is it maybe something that surprises you, or something that, being able to teach is a little different once you've moved into that team lead role, or is it kind of as expected?
It's definitely been a change, the way that I used to look at it. Obviously, I mean, I should step back a second. I kind of take a little bit of pride in myself of, the fact that I've always been pretty good at being able to see the coin from the other side, put the shoe on somebody else's, be able to analyze, when you're having a confrontation or a discussion, what is it that they're seeing, and but this has really solidified that, but it's also caused me to even have the feeling that, like, okay, so I need to make myself better, and that obviously comes through your own personal growth journey. But for the most part, it's been a pretty casual transition for me, like I say, because for the most part, my entire career, I've been mentoring people. What it has done over the years is really shown me that I enjoy teaching. I enjoy the light bulb moment. We'll put it that way. When you can show somebody that's struggling and they're like, oh, and they get it, and then a week later they get the same concern and they remember, because from my perspective and kind of tailing off of your little example there of trying a computer, you're gonna make mistakes, especially on the new side. You're gonna break a bulb. You're gonna misdiagnose something. It's just inevitable because you don't know everything. I don't know everything. And the person that says they know everything doesn't know anything, in my opinion. But what I try and instill in the techs in my shop is that, failure is going to happen, but it's only true, or mistakes are going to happen. It's probably a better way to say it. The only time it's a failure is when you didn't learn anything. If you didn't learn anything from that example or from that repair or whatever it was, then we failed. And is that my failure as the team captain, so to speak, or is it your failure in understanding what happened and you didn't care? That kind of thing. Because you still deal with that. So I don't care. I just want to fix it. And that's a hard one to overcome. I used an analogy once trying to explain it because you can't push a wet noodle. Somebody doesn't want to learn it. Somebody doesn't really care. It's like trying to push a wet noodle across the table. You can't push it straight. So
that's a pretty good analogy. I know there are a lot of technicians that listen to this podcast that aspire to do the same thing that you have gone through, right? What advice would you have for that technician that wants to take it to the next level, that wants to move into a position like this? And, hindsight's 2020, I think, but being able to maybe relay some advice of things you've learned along the way, I think would be really powerful for some of the folks that listen to this.
Yeah. The biggest thing that I discovered, growth is a choice. It's not automatic. It doesn't happen to you by getting out of bed the next day. You have to choose essentially to become better, to become a better version of yourself. And a lot of people have a hard time, even in just going back to the technician example of, mentoring. A lot of people have a hard time like, well, I want to be good. I want to be this. I want to be that. And it's like, okay, well, you like, oh, change 1% a day. That's really hard.
Yeah.
Really hard, because in a year, you're 3 times the person you were in the beginning than you were in the end. That's not possible. So my goal is, month to month, what did I do? What did I change? I recently went through and because one of the hardest things for me is to gauge how well of a job I'm doing in my shop, right? Yes, there are the numbers. Yep. I can see the production numbers. I can see the proficiency numbers. I can see the total hours, all that kind of stuff. But there's people behind those numbers. And I personally am on the belief that if the people are well taken care of in the business, in the shop, being, the technicians, parts, service advisors, all that kind of stuff, that automatically will produce a great experience. So
I think one of the things that I came away from our first conversation most impressed by was your mindset in really looking at that growth side of things. You actively read, you actively study, leadership. And I think that's the coolest thing. That was the best advice I ever had in my career, was one of my early mentors kind of making fun of me because I didn't read a whole lot about business and leadership. And it really ended up being very, very impactful for me. What was it that kind of drove you that direction? Because I frankly don't see a lot of technicians doing that, and you're doing a heck of a job at it. So what drove you to want to take that next level?
yeah, I mean, it was probably a little more than a decade ago is kind of when I started that, and then I did this for a handful of years where I didn't really do much. Kind of determined that, I liked reading books. I liked getting what I could out of the books. Reading it though was a little bit more difficult for me. My mind is always kind of racing, right? Always trying to think of the next problem or fixing the problem, whatever it is, My mind is very rarely idle. And, thank the Lord kind of thing that not podcasts, audiobooks, so I get book recommendations, or I find, listening to a podcast, somebody talks about a book, and I'll go grab the book and I'll listen to it. I got so much downtime essentially from a commute that rather than listening to the radio or politics or whatever, the people listen to, I'm going to listen to a book, and I'm going to try and take notes from it. Obviously, you can't write when you're driving, but the nice thing about a phone is you can talk to it; it'll type for you. So
Right.
I'll pause the book, and I always have the notepad open and just speak into the notepad the bits and pieces I get out of the book, and that's where a lot of these quotes and stuff that I hold on to and try and the ones that really impact me. That's where I get them from. That and the different handful of podcasts that I listen to now. So there was definitely a period of time where it was dry, but it picked back up in the last year or so, 2 years. So,
And I can tell in our conversations that you take what you're learning and apply it, right? And you're talking about it and your usage of quotes in some of these books just offer so much knowledge. And even if it gets you thinking differently or thinking more about something in regard to leadership or, for that matter, I've got Motor Age magazine sitting next to me, and you read through the diagnostic articles, and I'm guessing even that kind of stuff helps drive your brain to think through something a little bit more thoroughly. So, thinking about it in relation to soft skills, it does help you significantly in your customer interactions and your communication and your leadership style. And in talking with you, I could tell right away, that you're well educated on this stuff, and it comes through in your vernacular, right? It comes through in how you talk, and that's a huge advantage, I think, for those technicians that are listening out there to take seriously. If you're serious about taking the next step in your career, you got to put some time in. And I think what I've learned over the years is that the more I put into the reading and some of this other stuff, the studying, uh, the better you get and the more passionate you become about it. Right. I think then you desire to read more. And coming from me, who in high school probably didn't read a book, I think it completely changes the way you approach this.
oh, 100%. Yeah, and I like you say, just advice to those out there that are looking to um, go to that next level, right? Their leadership journey, it is a choice. It does, there's a couple of people that have left because, on more of the advisor side where, because they thought they were going to get a manager position or what have you, right? And I said, well, a lot of that has to do with, your personal growth journey. I've always tried to take it from the perspective of I'm going to start acting right now where I want to be. I wanted to be a shop leader. I'm going to start acting like it right now. I'm going to, not arrogantly or anything like that, but you have to be able to see yourself there first, I think. And if you can't see yourself there first, it's going to be really hard to attain that. And that's where I say, I stick behind growth is intentional. It doesn't happen on its own. It is very intentional.
How difficult was it when you are in that transition of roles? You probably worked alongside a lot of the people that you're now leading, in maybe getting them to look at you in a different light, and then really being able to get the best out of them, right? Get that productivity out of them, and really help them work to their potential. Was there a challenge as you transition to that, to maybe that different role?
A little bit. It was a lot of it has to do with how how do I how do I get that? How do I get to that end goal of getting I don't want them to look at me differently, to be honest. I want them to see me as an equal, because we are, like, I'm not their boss. I'm just the team lead, so to speak. I'm there to help them when they need help. And there's a book. It's a short one. It's a 1 minute manager, and it gives examples of how to go through and do things in short term time frames. 1 minute. And one of the things I took away from that is essentially starting. If I know somebody's struggling, or they're not doing as well as I know they can, and I want to try and help them. I know they're struggling. I know maybe something at home or whatever it is. But starting that conversation with, first off, I know you're way better than this. I know you are because I've seen it. I've watched it. There's documented proof of it. What do we need to do? How do we fix this? I'm on your side, to try and help you fix whatever it is that needs to be fixed. Sometimes there's nothing you can do. Sometimes it's a home issue. Sometimes it's just, oh, I don't feel like I've been treated fairly. Okay, let's talk about it. There's something that some of them might say I say too much at fault, or at fault of saying too much, so to speak. That perception without facts is very dangerous. So when you perceive that something is happening and you don't know the ins and outs of it, it can be very dangerous. And that again has to do with taking a step back, relaxing, not getting angry, maybe analyzing the situation and finding out, is there a reasonable explanation for it? And a lot of times there is, and that's where those facts behind the perception comes from. And it almost, I haven't ran into a situation where it's been like that it hasn't dissolved. It's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So it's just,
that is really good advice.
It comes down to communication. You got to talk enough to be able to, you got to talk enough and have an open enough relationship with the people that you're working with, that you can get to that common ground essentially. And one of the things I did recently, I think I started saying this, but one of the things I did recently was, it's really hard to measure how good of a job I'm doing, right? With the metrics, the numbers are there, but how do you know that the people are getting what they need? And so I just basically went around and told everybody, I have a shop meeting every morning at 9:30. So every morning at 9:30, we all get together. We talk about the day-to-day metrics of, how we were doing, how we did, anything important, anything, that we all need to know about, hey, on this vehicle, this is happening. So look out for that, anything that's going to help us do better, be faster. And I just told them, I said, I don't know how else to say this, but I want to know that I'm serving you guys the best that I can. And the only way I know how to do that is to talk with you guys one-on-one and have you tell me what you think I'm doing wrong, what you think I'm doing right. Am I doing something that I shouldn't be? Am I not doing something that I should be doing? All that kind of stuff. And I'm not talking to you at all. I want you to tell me. And it was actually pretty humbling on a couple of technicians. I was very, it pulled on the heartstrings of how much of an impact I've had for them. And made it know, it makes you know that you're doing it right. We're trying to, we're fixing cars, but you know what? We spend more time with these guys than our families. I see these guys more than I see my wife and kids. So, you got to enjoy where you're going. And, for the longest time in our shop, especially, it was probably more than 75% of them would have probably said, man, I hate going to work. I just hate it. And I was one of them, for the longest time, until the right people come in play where they start filling those empty boxes with actions that, that's my goal. My goal is to now flip that, where it's like, maybe there's one or two that don't like coming here, but everybody else is pretty excited to come into work and hang out, chat, work together, that kind of stuff. So
one of the biggest complaints I hear from technicians is that they don't feel like they're being listened to. And the fact that you're doing having these conversations, I think speaks to your leadership ability and style. I think there's a lot of value in that, in not only, listening to it, but as you mentioned, putting it into action. And maybe, I think in a leadership role, there's times where maybe there's something where you can't put it into action, and it's because of things outside of your control, but at least having the communication to say, hey, you were heard, but this is the reason why we can't do it. And I just think there's so much value in those one-on-one conversations. And if you put yourself in their shoes, similar to what we talked about earlier in the podcast, I think you feel a lot more satisfied if you can get some stuff off your chest. And if you can do it in a way that's not so contentious. I've talked about this in the past, but that technician that kind of throws the door open and comes in really, really upset, a lot of times they do that because they don't feel like they've been heard and they've bottled it up for so long. And I think you're able to get to the core of the issue faster doing it the way that you're doing it, rather than waiting for them to bust into your office or, in wherever they're at, come in and start yelling. I think it just makes it it makes it a lot better of a relationship.
Yeah, and my goal is to address the issues before they become an issue. I don't want to be a professional firefighter. I didn't sign up for that career, and so therefore I'm not trying. I don't want to be, and that's kind of how it was right away. We just felt like we were putting out fires, and I'm like, something has to change because this is not a way to do this job. And I would say that actually probably started changing even before I officially became the team lead, so to speak. So, but yeah, it's a journey, that's for sure.
It really
but it
is.
takes a great crew of guys. It takes a good crew of guys, and that is what we have here. I would say one of the things, I don't know if I want to say fear, but it's the only word I can think of right now. One of the fears I have is being a hypocrite. That's the one.
That's
I don't
good.
want to say one. I don't want to say one thing and be the guy that does that exact same thing. That is fear is a good word. That is something I fear. I really don't want to be a hypocrite.
It's funny that you point that out, because I think I've often had that same mindset, right? Where you are scared of being a hypocrite, and I think that from a character standpoint, that's probably a good thing, right? That you want to do what you say you're going to do and follow through on the things that you say you're going to do. And so the fact that you have that in mind, I think, lends itself to the fact that, hey, you are listening, you are a good leader. And I just give you all the credit in the world for that, because it is something that, after being in the industry as long as you have, and really growing outside of just your technical expertise, is why you're in the position you are today. And I think the sky's the limit for somebody like you, right? You've got that technical knowledge. You're gaining and gaining and gaining that leadership knowledge every day. At some level, that's kind of unicornish, right? Like, to have both of those things. And, as we speak to advice to technicians that, have bigger aspirations, you're all setting yourself up for a pretty good future if you can tie those two things together, the leadership side and the technical side. The world's kind of your oyster at that point. So I applaud everything you're doing out there. I'm a huge fan of everything we talked about, and how you prepare yourself, how you carry yourself, and really setting an example for not only the next generation of technicians, but current day technicians, and really how we as an industry, if we want the respect, we want the pay, we want all of this stuff, we've got to act a little differently as a whole. And I think everything that you're doing is that you're living it, right? And I just I can't extend a bigger compliment to somebody than what that is. You're living it out, and you've got a big fan in me.
Well, thank you. I tell the guys on my team the same thing that I do. I'm going to give you my best every day. Some days it's going to be good, really good. Some days it's not going to be good at all. But I know when I go home that it's going to be the best I had that day. And all I ask is the same thing.
I think that's
great.
I could not agree more. Could not agree more. And I think that's such a good way to end this episode. I do think we didn't get to a lot of the stuff that we had planned on talking about, right? And it was because there was so much good here. And so hopefully we'll get you back on the show, talk more in depth about some of the other stuff as well, because just some of this advice for those technicians that want maybe to grow in general was so good. So thank you for joining the show. Completely impressed, and appreciate you having you on.
Thank you.
That wraps up this week's episode of Beyond the Wrench. Be sure to tune in next week for another brand new episode. As a reminder, don't forget to rate and follow Beyond the Wrench on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps us get Beyond the Wrench in front of other fantastic shop owners, managers, technicians, and dealers just like you, so we can continue to help improve, promote, and grow this amazing industry. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll be back next week.